In this edition of 2020 Daily Trail Markers, spending on the race for the White House is nearing the $1 billion mark. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg is currently on track to spend nearly half of that by Super Tuesday. Other candidates are spending in the millions, but only some have the resources to spend in all Super Tuesday states. Many are also relying on super PACs to help with expenses. CBS News political unit associate producer Sarah Ewall-Wice is here with me now to discuss. Hi, Sarah. Great to see you. So the candidates are just spending profusely right now. Can you help break down the numbers for us a bit?
Sure. So Super Tuesday, 14 states have contests. That's the biggest haul. They're looking at over 1,300 delegates. That's about 34% of all delegates in the Democratic primary. To put that into perspective, those four early states we have been focused so closely on, that's about 4% of all delegates so far. So it's a huge haul. They need to be looking at it. But if you look at the numbers, there's over $236 million being spent in these Super Tuesday states on TV and radio ads. With that said, the majority of it is Mike Bloomberg.
Right. So before we get into Mike Bloomberg and the big numbers, I'm curious about the candidates who don't have that kind of money to spend. Going into Super Tuesday, is their strategy to double down on certain states or just spread it around among all of the states?
It's really a mix. If you look at all the candidates, obviously Mike Bloomberg is spending in all of them and outspending everyone in all of them. Behind him, you have Tom Steyer, who is spending $42 million. In Super Tuesday states, 35 million of that is in California, which is very delegate rich, but he isn't spending in every single Super Tuesday state. Candidates like Bernie Sanders, who has been leading, he's currently considered the front runner. He is actually spending in 13 of the 14 Super Tuesday states. He spent more than $16 million. The only state he's not spending in is his home state of Vermont. I guess he's pretty confident there. But other candidates just don't have that kind of funding. They're not even spending in the double millions, so they're under $10 million. You have Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, and Joe Biden, who are all spending under $6 million in these Super Tuesday states spread out across that entire group of states, because they really have to make the money last. And you can see when you look at the money that they had cash on hand at the end of January, which is the most recent filing that we've seen, some of them had under $10 million to their name, and they're coming out of these first contests, but they're also going into like the longest stretch of this race. So they really have to pick and choose where they're going.
Right. All right. So let's talk about Mike Bloomberg and the spending that he's doing. He's getting close to the $500 million mark. You know, I think for most Americans, you hear that number and it's sort of like funny money. You know, you can't even imagine that type of money. Is it leading to just sort of excess waste, or are we talking about staffers with six-figure salaries and catered lunches? Like, what can you spend that much money on?
Well, first of all, he is spending about $500 million. If you look at the ad spending across this entire cycle, you're talking Senate, House, and presidential race. It's basically $1 billion. So he's just contributing half of that so far. To put that into context, in 2016, the presidential race itself, with two primaries, Democrats and Republicans both vying for nominations, didn't hit the $1 billion mark until November of this year, or that year, 2016. So way far ahead of where anyone's ever seen spending at this point in time. If you go to a Mike Bloomberg event, you definitely see some things that are very different from other campaigns. There's usually food provided. Sometimes there's wine provided. He's flying all over the country more quickly, going from place to place, coast to coast, whereas other candidates are focused in more regional areas at a time and trying to hit up multiple stops. So it's just a different type of campaign.
Right.
When it comes to Super Tuesday, he's spending $167 million in those Super Tuesday states. He did not compete in the first four states. So this is really the first contest to see if it makes a dent in how the races in those states play out. At this time, he has been polling in the double digits. He hasn't really been leading in the polls in any of those states. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes the next 4 days before we hit Super Tuesday and what he does after that, if he changes up how he runs his race. I mean, we've only seen him in 2 debates so far, and they are both this month. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about Senator Elizabeth Warren and super PAC money. We know we've long been saying that she has been very critical of big money in the Democratic system. She's vowed for a long time not to take any corporate money, super PAC money. Now it appears that perhaps she's changing her tune, or she's turning a blind eye to the money that super PACs are spending on her. You asked the senator about this specifically. What did she tell you?
So I was actually there when she was asked in Nevada about this particular situation. The PAC, Persist PAC, started spending money for her. It's spent in Nevada, it's spending in South Carolina, and it's spending in the Super Tuesday states. Most recently announced it's going to be spending $9 million across Texas, California, and Massachusetts, her home state.
And by the way, she's receiving more help from super PACs than any other Democratic candidate now, correct?
At this point in time, yes, that PAC is putting the most money towards its support of Warren in this race heading into Super Tuesday.
And so how did she justify that, considering her past stance?
So she basically pointed out that when she jumped into this race, she called for all candidates to swear off super PAC money. And she claims that none of them took her up on the offer. No one was on board with it. So then she was looking at this race and she's seeing that, interestingly enough, all the men in the race had outside groups supporting them or were billionaires. And she pointed out to us that the two women in the race, I think she was referring to herself and Amy Klobuchar, were not supported by these outside groups. So you know what? She then decided if they are going to support her, she hasn't really said anything about that directly, but said if everyone gets on board with removing all super PAC spending, then she's completely on board. Until then, she's kind of shrugged it off.
You know, she has a point, because we know that women politicians have struggled to get the same kind of funding as male politicians. So, you know, who can blame her if other, you know, if the men on the stage are taking super PAC money, you know?
I will add to that. What's interesting, though, in this particular instance is Elizabeth Warren, when it comes to fundraising in this presidential race, grassroots fundraising, has been one of the leading candidates in the field. She has outraised every candidate in some quarters, or has been right behind Bernie Sanders in other quarters. So it kind of is a different type of race that we're running. But yes, that is definitely in general true that women candidates tend to have harder time fundraising than male candidates, and they just have a smaller pool of support backing them in terms of the big dollars.
Right, and we know that the dollars matter in American campaigns. They certainly do. Sarah Ewall-Wice, thank you for telling us about the dollars being spent on this one. Thank you.